Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we are going team by team predicting the Big Ten. I'm going through every game they're going to play. I'm going to predict a W and an L, as well as predicting an all Big Ten first team and giving out some awards and talking about what I would consider to be the preseason favorites for the awards that I'm going to give out at the end of the season. I don't normally do this at the beginning of the video, but I am going to ask you to like, comment, and subscribe right here. I put in a lot of work for this video. I've spent basically the whole past week working on it. So if you enjoy content like this, if you found my commentary insightful, go ahead and share it. Let other people know, especially if you aren't a Michigan fan. Because when the season starts, I am going to cover every Big Ten team. I'm going to make it a point to talk about at least once every Big Ten team every week. Because as a Detroit Lions NFL fan, I know what it feels like to watch, a big YouTuber or a national sports program and just not have your team or any of your players even mentioned once. And I don't want to do that to people and their teams. So I'm going to talk about everybody. If you want to watch the whole video, I'd very much appreciate it. Otherwise, there are timestamps in the description that will take you to your team, all 14 teams, and then you can go ahead and just skip to the end, see if I've got any of your players winning awards or making the All Big Ten first team, as well as potentially the Big Ten championship. And right at the very end, I go ahead and discuss what to expect next Tuesday. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with Rutgers. Now, unfortunately, I do think this year is going to be more of the same for you guys. Week 1, I do have you beating Northwestern, then I have you beating Temple before back-to-back losses versus Virginia Tech and Michigan, a home win against Wagner, a loss to Wisconsin, a loss to Michigan State, a W against Indiana, and then ending the season on 4 straight losses to Ohio State, Iowa, Penn State, and Maryland. This is a pretty difficult schedule. You play what is quite possibly the top 5 teams in the conference in Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, Wisconsin, and Maryland. So those are 5 pretty automatic losses, in my opinion. And then you play Iowa, who might be the 6th best team as well. Michigan State, I think, is going to be much improved. So this is a bit of a difficult schedule. I do think you're better than 4-8. I think you could potentially, maybe you can pull off an upset. If you're looking for an upset, it would probably have to be either MSU or Iowa to pull off the upset. You could probably beat Virginia Tech. That is a team that is currently in a rebuild of their own. That is a winnable game for you. So that could be a W. And then if you're looking for bowl eligibility, probably an upset win either at home versus MSU or on the road against Iowa. More likely to be MSU if they really fall apart this year without Peyton Thorne as their quarterback. But the real conversation that I want to have here is I want to tell you guys to be patient with Greg Schiano, because I do think he is going to get you to a place where you'll be consistently a solid program. Kind of like what Northwestern was, where they'd be a well-coached team, they'd have a really bad year, then they'd have an okay year, and then they'd have a shockingly good year. And sort of that 3-year cycle, I think that is something that Greg Schiano can bring you if you let him build the program back up, if you give him enough time to do that, which I hope you do, because I do think he will get you there eventually. Northwestern. You guys know. You guys know what this is going to look like this year. I got you going 2-10, and that's maybe generous. You could probably lose to UTEP, and I don't think you can win any of those other 10 games. I think they're all teams that are pretty clearly better than you in my mind. So we're going to go ahead and just skip to the actual conversation that I want to have. And that's not about Pat Riley. and the allegations. I don't want to touch that with a 25-foot pole. What I'd like to talk to you about is where you go as a program, because there are difficulties to being the head coach at Northwestern. I don't believe you give out full athletic scholarships in terms of covering tuition and everything that you would need to be a player at the university. I believe you also do not lower standards for athletes as well, or a bit more lenient in terms of allowing them to get in. As a Michigan fan, I know what that's like. So, how do you go forward? How do you regain what you were in the 2010s, where you were on that sort of 3 year cycle where you would have a bad year, a pretty okay year, and then an honestly really good year? So, how do you get back to that? Because I do believe that is very likely your ceiling. And the way you would get back to that is by making an excellent head coaching signing. And you are not going to be able to pull big names that you're pretty sure are going to be successful. Sharon Moore is a name that's been thrown out several times. I do not believe that he's going to become the next head coach at Northwestern. I do think he is going to be a head coach somewhere. I do not believe it will be at Northwestern. I don't think he would take that job. You could make the argument that Western Michigan this past year was a better place to be than Northwestern right now, and he turned down the Western Michigan job. I'm not trying to insult your program. You have a great history these past 20 years or so, but this is, for the foreseeable future, this seems like a bit of a shit show. I'm going to be honest with you. You're going to have some hard times going forward unless you knock that head coaching hire out of the park, which is a legitimate possibility. Take your time. You're going to have a whole year, because we all know it's not going to be the interim head coach. You're too late into the year to fire the whole coaching staff, so you fired the head coach, and now you're going to promote whatever coordinator he was. I think he was the DC, and spend this year looking at all the head coaching candidates and trying to find your guy, maybe a guy that's under the radar or a year or two away from actually being considered for a head coaching job. You scoop in, hire him up early, give him some time. That should be the game plan for you guys right now. Indiana, you're up next, and unfortunately, I've got you guys going 2-10 with your 2 wins coming against Indiana State and Akron, and you go ahead and run the Big Ten gauntlet and lose every single game. I mean, you do have some players that I like. I do like Jalen Lucas and Taven Jackson and Jameer Johnson on defense, but this team, I just don't think it has the talent right now to compete at really any level. You're likely going to be looking for a new head coach after this year. Tom Allen has been there for, I believe, 7 years and never really done anything outside of that 2020 year, but that appears to have been more Michael Penix than it was Tom Allen. For what it's worth, I think you're a more attractive option than a lot of other potential openings in that lower Power 5 sort of spot, because I do think you have some talent, and I do think you could potentially have a little bit more in-state recruiting prowess. There is some serious talent at the high school level in Indiana, so if you get yourself a recruiter like Maryland did, you could find yourself with a good amount of talent and potentially turn this program around a little bit. But when push comes to shove, I don't think Tom Allen lasts this season, and it's going to be a bit of a down year, in my opinion. All right, Nebraska. Listen, I get that this is my official prediction. It's 4-8, but we don't know anything about Nebraska football right now. We don't know who the quarterback's going to be. It could be Jeff Sims coming in from Georgia Tech, but you look at those first 2 games of the year, you could very easily win those games. You could beat Minnesota. You could beat Colorado. You could get Michigan. I think that is a major red flag game for Michigan. Got them at home, you usually play them tough, so I think that could be a game where Matt Rule is coming out and saying this is the biggest game on our schedule. We need a program defining win. So that is a game to watch. And then I have you beating Illinois, Louisiana Tech, and Northern Illinois, as well as Northwestern. You could beat MSU and potentially Iowa as well. I don't think you're going to get Maryland or Purdue or Wisconsin, though. I think those three are pretty safe losses, in my opinion, pretty likely to happen. I do think Matt Rule is going to get you going probably next year, not so much this year, though. You very easily could beat Minnesota and Colorado and maybe pull off an upset against MSU or Iowa or Michigan, even. I already kind of talked about that. And get yourself to a bowl game or maybe even 7 wins or so. That's a very realistic possibility. Right now, I am most comfortable putting you at 4-8 this year just because there's been so much change to the roster and we don't really know how Matt Rule is going to look year 1. I think year 3 we know what he's going to be, and I think you're going to be a well-coached, tough football team that is in a lot of games that they maybe shouldn't be and wins all the games that they're supposed to. So you very easily could have more wins than this. This might be the least confident I am in any record prediction because there are just so many question marks surrounding this team right now. In terms of major storylines surrounding this team, I think you stuck with Scott Frost for too long. I think it was pretty clear after year 3 that he really wasn't going to turn it around. But you have that connection with him, so you decided to keep him around. And I think it did hurt your program a little bit. What I think you should do going forward is I think you should reach out to the Big 12 and schedule a game or two against Big 12 opponents, specifically in Texas, like every year. Like have a home and home with Texas Tech, and then have another home and home with like Baylor or somebody, or maybe TCU, or just a situation like that, so that you can go to these Texas recruits because you're right there, and you can be like, hey, we're going to go play a game in Texas every other year. With Texas leaving the Big 12, I think that opens the door for a lot of those Texas kids that are maybe lower end 4 stars or higher end 3 stars that would have gone to Texas because they got the opportunity from Texas, so they would have gone there. But now that their parents won't really be able to see them play every week because they're going to go travel to Florida or Auburn or Alabama or wherever, you can scoop in and potentially make some gains in the recruiting trail that way. And Matt Rule is a recruiter. He was really a recruiter as a head coach when he was at Baylor, which is why I didn't think he was going to work out in the NFL, and sure enough, he didn't. But I do think he is a good football coach at the college level, and I think he's going to get this program on track. It's just likely not going to be this year. Michigan State is up next, and officially I'm having them go 5-7 this year, with wins against Central Michigan and Richmond before following it up with 3 straight losses to Washington, Maryland, and Iowa, then a win against Rutgers, and then a loss to Michigan, a loss to Minnesota, a win against Nebraska, a loss to Ohio State, a win against Indiana, and a loss to Penn State. If you're looking for bowl game eligibility, which should be your goal this year after the disaster that was last year, Iowa or Minnesota is probably going to be the place. I don't think you can beat Washington, Maryland, Ohio State, or Penn State. Michigan is a rivalry game. You never know. I just think Michigan is a bad matchup for this team, and this team has so many question marks. Now, I do think the running back tandem of Jalen Berger and Nathan Carter are going to be really good. Nathan Carter played at UConn, I believe, last year, and I thought that he was a really good football player. Don't know about Noah Kim at quarterback, and receiving core is also relatively unproven, along with a veteran offensive line. The offense could be pretty okay. Not as sold on the defense as I am on the offense. You do have some transfers. Samar Melvin in the secondary potentially could be a solid player, but this team just has a lot of holes in it right now. And the conversation becomes, if you go 5-7 this year, or hell, if you go worse than 8-4, I think the conversation has to be, is Mel Tucker the guy? And I'm not saying this just because I am a Michigan fan, okay? Let's take that argument and throw it in the goddamn trash. I don't take the rivalry outside of rivalry week, okay? I'd say I have Michigan State friends, but I only have one friend, and he's also a Michigan fan. But I don't have anything against Michigan State when I'm talking about this. When a coach is getting paid like Mel Tucker, he has to deliver results. And to me, when you're getting paid like Mel Tucker, 8 wins is the absolute floor. You should not be able to go below that. Last year, you look back on it, maybe it's an aberration. Maybe it was, oh man, everything just kind of fell apart and it didn't work out. But he hasn't had a good defense while he's been there. And he is a secondary guy, if I remember correctly. He cut his teeth as a secondary coach. And you've had arguably the worst secondary in college football the past 2 seasons, in 2022 and 2021. So that is also very concerning. I get that he's not doing the position work with those guys, but it is alarming nevertheless, especially when you're a defensive guy and you're being carried by the offense. That's another red flag. So if you underperform this year, which 5-7 is underperforming, the conversation becomes, can you afford to fire Mel Tucker and pay his buyout? To potentially go and pay another coach a crap load of money to come here. I'm not sure about the money, but I do think of all the teams likely to fire a head coach, or even just like dark horses like you guys are, you would be the most attractive place to go, even when you take into account coaches potentially leaving for upgraded positions. So I think you would still be a very attractive spot, because when Michigan State is rolling, they're a legitimate contender for the Big Ten, and there aren't a whole lot of programs. There's probably only, 6 of the soon-to-be 14 teams that can actually win the conference, and I think Michigan State is one of them. You do have that upside. You're like the Baylor of the Big Ten, where the floor is the absolute basement, and the ceiling is the snobbish rich kid table in the lunchroom. So can Mel Tucker get you there? Because you were there in 2021. 11 wins is the hallmark of an elite program. If you get 11 wins consistently, you are an elite program in my mind. And if I'm being entirely honest with you, I didn't really like the Mel Tucker hiring to begin with. Now, he kind of proved me wrong in 2021, but then he's proven me right the other 2 years that he's been a coach. So this year is going to be the make it or break it year for Mel Tucker. And losing arguably the best 2 players on your roster. Well, you lost the best player on your roster. It does not matter what position you're talking about. There isn't an argument. And Keon Coleman, he was the best player on your roster. And you can make the argument that Peyton Thorne was the second best on your roster. It was either him or Jacob Windman. But this team has the potential to be pretty good on offense. And if you can just be bad on defense, not horrible, then you can maybe get to a bowl game, and then depending upon who you play in the bowl game, maybe get to like 7 wins or so. And that's a step in the right direction, and that probably saves Mel Tucker his job. But if he ends up going 5-7, I think he's probably gone. You got to somehow figure out a way to get the money and get him out the door. But that's just me, and what do I know, man? Oh, baby, we getting spicy with this Wisconsin take that I got going on right here. I think you're going to be really good this year, Wisconsin. I got you opening up with 3 straight wins in the non-conference versus Buffalo, Washington State, and Georgia Southern. Washington State is somewhat concerning because they do have a quarterback in Cam Ward that is a very good player, so they're going to be able to score on anybody, and that is not a very confident W, in my opinion. Georgia Southern and Buffalo should win when you should win those games pretty easily. At Purdue, if that game was at home, I would predict you to win that game. But it's in Purdue. Purdue doesn't have a tremendous home field advantage, but it's a toss-up game to me. I think Hudson Card is going to be a very good player for them, and I'm going to give you the L there. I got you beating Rutgers, Iowa, and Illinois the next 3 weeks. I don't really think any of those games are going to be close. Iowa always plays tough. Illinois with Brett Bielema, you can't count them out. Then I have you doing maybe the impossible, and this is an actual legitimate prediction that I am making. If you go and look at the Ohio State section of this video, I'll put up on the screen where that begins for you. I am also going to say that Wisconsin is going to beat Ohio State. I'm not just saying this in your section of the video, hoping you don't look at the other sections of the video so I can contradict myself. That's not the way I operate. Everything about that game just seems to me like you're going to bring everything you have, and Ohio State isn't going to be prepared for it. Ohio State will be coming off of a tough game against Penn State, what I think is going to be a very close game, maybe an emotional win for Ohio State. They come out and get a bit of a letdown against you guys. I think you match up well against them. I think the strength of your team is your interior offensive line, and I think the weakness of Ohio State's defense is their interior defensive line. They have fine players. Michael Hall is likely going to go in the first round, but he's 6'2" and 285 pounds, so he can be moved in the run game. And I believe you're going to have a good enough passing game where you'll be able to run the ball. Maybe you got to start off the game by slinging it around a little bit. Then you can start ground and pound. And I think your defense is going to come to play. I think they're going to draw up one hell of a game plan for you. And I think Luke Fickell, more than anything else, is going to want to announce, hey, Wisconsin is in the elite teams club now that I'm here. And he's going to do that by beating the team that he thinks he should be the head coach of against Ohio State. I don't really have a whole lot of football reasons why I think you're going to win that game right now, but there's a lot of contextual reasons why I believe you can win that game and why I think you will win that game. You follow that up against Indiana, which should be an easy W. You got basically 2 bye weeks back-to-back against Indiana and Northwestern. A potentially tough game against Nebraska. Might get caught looking ahead to Minnesota for the rivalry game, but I got you winning that game as well. I do have you losing to Minnesota because I'm going to be honest with you. I think you're going to have 2 Big Ten losses, and the rivalry game, you never know. In all likelihood, you're probably going to switch the W and the L with Ohio State and Minnesota. I don't know if you would take that or not. I don't know if the rivalry is that heated. Like, I know it's a rivalry. I know it's competitive. But if you asked, like, a Michigan fan, would you beat Penn State but then lose to a Ohio State team who's having a down year and then get to make the Big Ten championship anyway? I don't know if they're going to say yes. And I don't know if you would say, yeah, sure, I'll take the loss to the rival so that we can beat the big team on our schedule. So you go ahead and let me know in the comment section. I'd love to hear your opinions on this. But I think 10-2 in a debut year for Luke Fickell is going to announce, oh, you can't write Wisconsin out yet. I think Luke Fickell is going to elevate your program because under those, early 2010s teams, post Russell Wilson, the only thing that kept you from winning the Big Ten consistently was the quarterback play. And I believe Luke Fickell is going to be able to recruit quarterbacks to Wisconsin, which is something that you've always struggled with. Really, outside of Russell Wilson, you haven't had a great quarterback in a while. Tanner Mordecai is probably the best quarterback you've had since Russell Wilson. And Braylon Allen is really good. and your offensive line is solid. Jack Nelson is an NFL guy. I think your receiving core with the transfers is looking better. And I think the defense has the potential to be one of the better units in the Big Ten as well. I think this is an all around very, very good team. And I think Luke Fickell, with the Ohio State game, is going to announce himself and say, I am elevating this program. Now, I'll tell you straight up, 10-2, even with the 2 in conference losses to Purdue and Minnesota, you're still going to the Big Ten championship game. Now, you can jump to Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, and see who ends up there with you, but we will talk about that later on in the video as well. All in all, I really like this team. I really like Luke Fickell. He might be the best coach in the Big Ten. I think that's a legitimate possibility because we haven't really seen him at a program with the resources that you guys have. So he very easily could come out and solidify himself as a top 5 coach in college football this year. Maryland, you're up next. I got you going 8-4. I do think you could potentially be better than that, but I do have you picking up a stray L against Nebraska. Start off the year, open it with a couple of cupcakes against Towson and Charlotte before having a home game versus Virginia, go on the road to Michigan State, and then at home versus Indiana. It's a pretty easy first 5 games. You get your first real test of the season in the shoe in Columbus, Ohio, where unfortunately I have you taking an L. I think it's pretty unlikely for you to beat Ohio State just in terms of style of play, in terms of what I think your defense is going to look like. I think you're going to struggle to play with Ohio State. It's not something that should be all that surprising, but it's just my opinion. Got you beating Illinois. The following week, I think Illinois is going to take a step back this year. Then I have you beating Northwestern, who is in all likelihood going to be terrible, before losing at home to Penn State, losing on the road to Nebraska, and then losing at home versus Michigan. You could very easily beat Nebraska. That is something that I could see happening pretty easily. I think if you were going to pull off an upset, it would probably be, in terms of matchups, it would probably be Penn State. Of the 3 other, Big East teams, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, if you were to pull off an upset, I would guess that it would be Penn State, as they could perhaps be looking ahead a week to their matchup against Michigan. I do like your roster, even though you are losing a lot of production on the offensive side of the ball. I think you are a very talented roster. Caden Prather, who we'll talk about later on in this video, I think might end up being in all Big Ten contention. You have probably the best returning quarterback in the Big Ten in Tulila Tagovailoa, as well as a experienced offensive line and potentially an improved defense, although I'm not sure how much it will improve. All in all, I think Mike Locksley is the guy for you. I would personally be potentially a little bit worried about him leaving for a bigger job should one become available. I doubt it will, because all of the big quote-unquote jobs that he would be willing to leave for are still probably a year or 2 away from them firing their current coach. I think like Texas A&M, Florida, Oklahoma potentially, because I don't think Brett Venerables is going to do jack shit at Oklahoma. All of those programs are still probably a year or 2 away from firing their current guy, so I wouldn't be worried about it so much this offseason. But he is someone who I think teams at those bigger programs would be interested in looking at, because he's such a high-level recruiter and such a good offensive play caller as well. Minnesota, the Golden Gophers, I got you guys opening up the year with a W against Nebraska and a W against Eastern Michigan before a tough game against North Carolina, which I have you taking the L2. I just think Drake May and that offense is going to be a little bit too much for you. In my opinion, I do think the defense is solid. I don't think it's good, but I think it's solid. You got a lot of experienced players out there, but I don't think it's really going to matter when you're playing potentially a Heisman contending quarterback. and a Hall of Fame caliber head football coach. But I got you bouncing back the next 2 weeks with W's against Northwestern and Louisiana Lafayette. Before I have you taking a home loss to Michigan, it is somewhat of a rivalry game. Maybe you get up for it. Maybe you come out and you play. Maybe you catch Michigan on a bad day or whatever. Maybe they were looking past you. You could pull the upset there. It's not impossible. I have you losing to Iowa the following week as well. I am not as high on Iowa as some other people are, but I do think it is still likely an L in my mind. I have you winning against Michigan State and Illinois before taking a close loss to Purdue. I do just think Purdue is better. They're a sneaky team this year. They could get to double-digit wins with Hudson Card as their quarterback. And then a loss at Ohio State. That's pretty self-explanatory. And then I have you upsetting Wisconsin at home. It's a rivalry game. Last week of the season, Wisconsin maybe. I've already spoken about them, so you can jump back into the video if you want to hear me talk about Wisconsin. But Wisconsin may be at that point 10-1 and firmly in the playoff discussion. So you guys get to pull off the upset and knock them out of that conversation. I think PJ Fleck is a very good football coach. I think he's going to get you into that 3-year cycle sort of mode where, 1 year you're just sort of battling for a bowl game, and I think that's this year. I do have you going 7-5, so that's kind of where I've got you at right now. Then next year, I could definitely see this team improving quite a bit, get to that 8-9 win mark, and then in a third year, every third year or so, you end up with a team that can legitimately compete and win a lot of football games, maybe even play with some of the upper echelon teams. Unfortunately, with USC and UCLA joining the conference, I don't particularly believe you're going to be contending for Big Ten titles anytime soon, but I do really like PJ Fleck. Not only that, but I like the coaching staff that he has around him, and I think this is going to be a very consistent and very productive program for a long time. But when it comes to this year specifically, there are a couple of players that I really like for you. I think Sean Tyler is going to be productive as a transfer, as well as Brevin Spanford. He's an NFL caliber tight end, maybe the best in this upcoming draft class. And Chris Autman-Bell is another guy that I really like. I think he's a draftable NFL wide receiver. And Ethan Kaliak-Manis at quarterback, I think is going to be good. I think he's going to improve from last year and become a solid quarterback with a decent running game so you can get the play action going, and a honestly pretty good group of receivers and tight ends and running backs to throw the ball to. So could very well be a productive football player. Iowa Hawkeyes. I got you guys starting off with a W against Utah State before going on the road and beating Iowa State during the second week of the season. An underrated rivalry game in terms of like college football and specifically the Big Ten. Not that it's in conference rivalry or anything, it's not, but it's just from a national perspective, an underrated rivalry. Most of the games are pretty close and pretty entertaining, so I got you winning that game this year, following that up with a W against Western Michigan before taking a road loss to Penn State. Then you come home, you beat Michigan State, and then you lose at home to Purdue. That is the game where if you're looking at on the schedule on how many L's that you can maybe turn into W's, that's probably the one game. I do think Wisconsin in Camp Randall is better than you. I do think you're going to lose that game the next week. But then I got you rattling off 5 wins to end the season against Minnesota, Northwestern, Rutgers, Illinois, and Nebraska. None of those teams are particularly good. If you're going to lose one of them, it's probably going to be either Minnesota or Nebraska in my mind. But I believe this team is better than last year, potentially, even though I do think there is going to be some changes after this year, and changes that probably should have happened a while ago. All right, you got Cade McNamara transferring in at quarterback. As a Michigan fan, I can tell you right now, this kid is okay. He's okay. If you're going to run the ball a lot and you just want him to throw the ball over the middle to the tight ends, then you'll be okay. And unfortunately, if you're going to ask him to do more than that, he really can't. He's not someone who's going to throw the ball 25, 30 times a game and be effective. He's not somebody who can throw the deep ball really effective. He's basically immobile, and he needs good offensive linemen, which you guys always have good offensive linemen, so that's not a concern really, but he does pretty consistently falter under pressure, but he's not going to be as big of a problem as Brian Ferentz is. While he has been the play caller at Iowa, they have not had a good offense. Even before he was the play caller, it wasn't like you guys were lighting it up, so to speak. But with UCLA and USC coming into the conference now, you're gonna need to be able to score points. I do think you still have the potential to compete in the Big Ten at a high level, but it's going to have to be with someone other than Brian Ferentz calling the plays. And I don't know if Kirk has it in him to fire his kid. I know he took a pay cut this past year, but he has no business being the play caller. Maybe if you don't want to fire him, demote his ass and then bring in somebody. I don't know, but you've got to figure a way to get yourself a real play caller and maybe even a guy who can recruit some big time athletes to your team. On the offensive side of the football, you get guys on the offensive line and the defensive line, and occasionally a linebacker that are legit NFL talents, and then you get some very productive defensive backs that are, pretty much all universally go day three, and sometimes they manage to work their way onto the field. Sometimes they're special teams players. There's a good amount of variance when you're talking about Iowa corners and safeties and all that. And you've gotten plenty of really good tight ends that didn't produce jack shit while they were there at Iowa. I mean, the most recent case is Sam Laporta. Sam Laporta, I think, could have been the first tight end off the board if he had actually gotten the ball and had a productive, even just mildly productive passing game. But that isn't the case right now for you guys. And if you're going to continue to be the program that you have been this past decade, then you're going to need to find somebody to call plays for you. Illinois, after a great year last year, I got you following up with a somewhat mediocre season. I do think this is a rebuilding year for you. So making a bowl game and ending up 6-6 is a win for me. I got you starting off with a W against Toledo. Toledo is a sneaky MAC team, but I just think your defense is going to be too overpowered for them to score enough points to win the game. Same thing with Kansas. Although Jalon Daniels is a very good player, I don't think he's going to be able to just survive the relentless pass rush that you are going to have in that game with Jerzon Newton and Keith Randolph Jr. You follow that up with a loss to Penn State. I don't think you can win that game. I think Penn State's defense is going to be just as good or better than yours this year, and I think their offense and your offense is going to be night and day. So I think Penn State wins that game. I got you following it up with 2 W's, Florida Atlantic at home and at Purdue. That one is probably my least confident W that I've got on this roster, but I just don't believe that you lose to every single team in the Big Ten that isn't absolutely horrible like Indiana and Northwestern. I think you're a quality football team. I think 6-6 or 7-5 is likely where you're going to end up being. And I just thought Purdue was probably going to be the game that you had the best chance of pulling off the upset, so I gave you that W. I think you win one of Purdue, Nebraska, Maryland, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. You could get 2 of them. I don't think Minnesota or Iowa are unobtainable W's. Same with Nebraska, but Purdue was where I went for that W there. I do have you losing again to Nebraska, Maryland, Wisconsin, Minnesota in 4 weeks straight. Maryland, I just think, has too much firepower. I think they're going to be able to get around the pass rush and make some plays, and I don't think your offense is going to be able to score enough points to keep you in the game. Wisconsin, a much more balanced team, a much better offensive line that may be able to deal with the pressure more effectively, and I just think they're just a better team than you right now. Minnesota, you could win. That's probably my least confident L that you're taking is Minnesota, but I do just kind of have a feeling about them in Minnesota. I just think they're probably going to win that game. And then you got a W against Indiana because they're horrible. I actually take in an L at Iowa, and then finishing the season with a win against Northwestern to get yourself bowl eligible. As far as general thoughts go, I really like Brett Bielema as a football coach. I think he is a real football coach. I think he will get your program to be consistently good. I think you have an identity, and I believe that you are always going to be a scrappy team that plays really good defense as long as Brett Bielema is your head coach. As far as players go, I think replacing Chase Brown is the biggest hurdle that you have to overcome this year. You lost a couple of good defensive backs as well, but I think you're always going to have good DBs. Maybe not Devon Witherspoon good, but good DBs nevertheless. I think your offensive line will be solid. I think you'll probably at least be okay running the football. The real question is, can Isaiah Williams and Luke Altmaier give you enough in the passing game to not have teams put 8 people in the box and limit the run game this year? Either way, I think this is honestly a pretty winnable schedule. I think you could probably beat Nebraska, Minnesota, and Iowa. I think all of those games are on the table, as well as pulling off an upset against one of Purdue, Maryland, and Wisconsin. Again, the most likely option is Purdue in my mind. On the defensive side of the ball, Jerzon Newton and Keith Randolph are obviously the headliners. I think Jerzon Newton is, at this point, a first-round prospect, and Keith Randolph Jr. likely a day 2 pick, probably late second or early third, in my opinion. I think this is going to be a solid year if Altmaier and Isaiah Williams can give you a bit more juice in the passing game. Then you could win 8 or 9 games maybe. Purdue, fun fact, my uncle went to Purdue. He was a graduate of the engineering college over there. I think this is going to be a really good year for you guys. With Hudson Card, I think the offense is going to be fine, and with Ryan Walters as your new head coach, I think he's going to get your defense going, and I think you're going to see something that you haven't had in a while, and that's a actual defense that can get stops consistently. I've got you pulling off 4 straight W's to begin the year, versus Fresno State, at Virginia Tech, versus Syracuse, and home versus Wisconsin, in what has a decent chance to be a ranked matchup in my opinion, and I have you winning that game. I think it's early on in the year, and I think you have the better quarterback. That's the main rationale I have about you guys winning that game. I think this is going to be a statement win for Ryan Walters. However, we are not at that level yet where the emotions aren't going to get to you, so you're going to follow up that emotional win versus Wisconsin with a loss to Illinois. I also think Illinois is just a bad matchup for you. I think the weakest part of your team is probably your offensive line this year, and Illinois' defensive line is very, very good, with 2 defensive tackles that have a decent chance of going into the first round, both of them. I got you following that game with a win at Iowa before a home loss to Ohio State. You're going to win on the road versus Nebraska before taking an L at Michigan. Home versus Minnesota, I'm giving you the W there. I'm giving you the W against Northwestern and Indiana because I don't think either of those teams are very good. All in all, I think this is going to be a good year. You have a real chance at 10 wins. Probably going to play a quality bowl game or against a quality team in the bowl game. This might be like Florida is 6-6, so we're going to put you against like the fifth best Big Ten team and see what happens. I could see you getting that game. There's always one every year, so I think this is just straight up. I just think you're going to be a good football team this year, and you have a very winnable schedule. I think the amount of 50-50 games on here aren't really very much. I think Wisconsin, maybe Minnesota, and Iowa are like your only 50-50 games. Everything else, I feel pretty confident that you're going to win. Syracuse with Dino Babers, they're probably going to be well coached, but they had their good year last year, so they're going to have a down year for the next 2 or 3 years, and then they'll have a good year. But I think you're pretty likely going to beat Syracuse. Virginia Tech is in the middle of a massive rebuild. They're not going to be any good this year. As far as general thoughts go, Hudson Card is a legitimate all Big Ten team candidate in my mind. I think he's going to lead a very effective offense. I think you guys have always had effective offenses, and I think you're going to continue to have an effective offense this year. And Ryan Walters, who is one of the most under the radar guys in college football right now, he is one of the best young coaches at any level of football, in my opinion. I think he is potentially a budding superstar at the coaching position. I very much like him. I like the way he ran the defense at Illinois, and I think he's going to bring that here to Purdue. I think they're going to be technically sound. I think they're going to play hard and fast, and I think he's going to be able to recruit some hidden gems or some local area guys that maybe would have gone out of state. I think they'll be able to stay home with Ryan Walters now. All in all, I think this is going to be a pretty good run for you as long as Ryan Walters is your head coach. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I personally wouldn't be getting too attached to Ryan Walters. I think he's a candidate to jump ship in 3 or 4 years if a major site opens up, or even just upgrade in pay. Like if South Carolina or Florida ends up coming open, I think he'll be a strong candidate for those positions. Penn State fans, I wish I didn't have to do this to you. You've seen the screen already. I'm going to go game by game, but you've seen the screen already. I really wish I didn't have to do this to you. Let's go ahead and get the left side of the screen out of the way here. You're opening up against West Virginia. That might be a sneaky team. West Virginia's got a really good offensive line, but you're going to win that game by 20 points or more. Delaware, not going to bother. Illinois should win pretty easily. Iowa, Northwestern, UMass, also teams that I don't think can contend with you. Same thing with Indiana, Rutgers, and Michigan State. Maryland might be a little bit sneaky, but probably not. And then, of course, you have Ohio State and Michigan. And I wish to God that I didn't have to do this to you, because you are probably going to be a preseason top 7 team for me in the country. I do think you are genuinely going to be one of the 10 best teams in college football this year. Like last year, I was looking at this roster and I said, oh my God, next year is your year. Well, unfortunately, it turns out that this is also Ohio State and Michigan's year as well. I mean, Ohio State is, barring none, clearly the most physically talented team in the country. They are more talented than Georgia. Ohio State might legitimately have 17 or 18 players that are going to get drafted in the 2024 NFL draft class. If considering a couple of other factors, like the quarterback ends up being a one and done and playing really well and playing like a draftable prospect, and there's a couple of other players, but maybe a tackle, one of those tackles that they've got ends up being really good and being draftable, but there's a couple of factors in there that would get them to that high number. But worst case scenario, they've got 14 kids that are going to get drafted. That is an extraordinarily talented team. And I think you're an extraordinarily talented team as well. But Ohio State does better than you are. Also, it's in Columbus, and you do have a history of playing against Ohio State. You got the one win in 2016. That was a once-in-a-lifetime type of win. And even though you've always gotten up to play Ohio State, you've never really been able to beat them. Like, you've had some close games. Like, I think 2017 2017, was it, where you were ranked number 2 and they were ranked number 6? Saquon took the opening kick return for a touchdown. Was that 2017? I don't remember. But that game, you got off to the early lead, and then it was quite evident to me about halfway through the third quarter that it was inevitable that you were going to lose that game because you just couldn't stop Ohio State and your offense stopped working. I don't mean to bring up old wounds and everything like that. I don't want to do that because I mean, I love this roster. I think this is one of the 7 or 8 best teams in all of college football. I think if you played in the Pac-12, you would be head and shoulders above everybody except for USC. I think if you played in the Big 12, you'd be head and shoulders above everybody except maybe Texas. I think if you played in the ACC, you'd be right there with Clemson and maybe just a tad bit behind Florida State. But in the Big Ten, you're kind of slotted into third. I don't think you're going to beat Ohio State because you haven't shown me that you have the ability to beat Ohio State. I do think James Franklin is a very good football coach who runs a very, very good program, but just can't beat Ohio State for whatever reason. They always play really well. They always have a good game plan, but you guys just never finish against it. And Michigan, who you have had a bit of a back and forth with, or at least more of, I think while Jim Harbaugh is there, you're 5-3 or 4-3 or something like that. And if you were going to win one of those 2 games, it would probably be Michigan at home. I'm not entirely sure if this has been confirmed, but I have seen rumors that the night game is not going to be Michigan, but is actually like more likely to be Iowa. I don't know how you would possibly let that happen because in 18 or 19, where it was 28-24 and Ronnie Bell dropped the game-winning touchdown against you guys, so you guys ended up winning. That atmosphere won you that football game, and that is a definitive advantage. It's just that you've kind of done it 2 or 3 times versus Ohio State, and like you're not going to beat Ohio State because I think your record in whiteout games is like 5-4, but then like 3 of the 4 losses are to Ohio State. You can't take that like at face value because there's mitigating factors like the fact that for whatever reason you're just cursed against Ohio State to lose. Michigan is, just like last year, I think a bad matchup for you. I think the weakness of your team this year, I say weakness, quote unquote, because you don't really have one, but the weakest part of your roster, in my opinion, is your interior defensive line and your linebacker unit. And Michigan has some really good interior offensive linemen. They have the best. I mean, I'm not even going to parse language here with you. They had the best offensive line in the Big Ten at a minimum. They might have the best offensive line in the entire country. I think they're going to be able to run the football, and it's just a bad matchup for you. I don't know how else to say it. It's like you're a fire type going up against a water type in Pokemon. It's just like, it's a bad matchup. And you definitely could win, but you're at a disadvantage. Some general thoughts to get away from this. I think Drew Allar is going to be very good. I'm not so sure this year you're going to see like first round type of quarterback out of him. He has first overall pick arm talent. Like, let's get that out of the way. He has first overall pick arm talent. I'm not parsing words. I don't say shit like that very lightly. So when I say it, I mean it. He has special arm talent. And I think he can move around a little bit. I don't think he's just a statue. But last year, he was very clearly over his head. And this year, I think he will have some experience underneath him. I mean, those first 6 games, you should win those games pretty easy. And then you go to Columbus. That might be a little bit tough for him. But then you're home against Michigan. Could win that game. I think he's going to be very good. I don't know how, but you guys always have good wide receivers. So he'll have some players to throw the ball to. I think you can make the case that Olu Fashanu is the best offensive lineman in the country. And I think your offensive line is going to be good to great. It might be the second best in the Big Ten. You're not at Michigan's level, or at least not preseason you aren't, because Michigan just has more proven talent along the offensive line right now. But you're definitely number 2. Chop Robinson is a defensive player of the year type of candidate. I think he's a top 10 talent in this upcoming draft class that is loaded with edge rushers. I think he's really, really good. I think Kalen King, you can make the case he is the best corner in the country. regardless of scheme. I think if you're talking about zone corners purely, he's the best corner in the country. Probably it's either him or what was that kid's name? Cyphers. He transferred from Virginia to Florida State last year. I think he's really good in zone coverage as well. But Kalen King is going to be a first round pick. Has a decent chance to go in the top 20. This is a really talented, really good roster, and I wish I could predict you to beat either Ohio State or Michigan, because I desperately want all three of those teams to end up 11-1 with them beating each other, because it would just be absolute chaos for the college football playoff committee. And I think it would be hilarious to watch and see them try to justify whoever the fuck they leave out of the playoffs. But unfortunately, I just thinking about it, like, you're not going to beat Ohio State, and Michigan is just a bad matchup to you. So I've got to give you L's in those games, so you end up 10-2. Ohio State, you are finally getting talked about here in this video. And you see on screen, I am predicting you to go 11-1, with the only loss being somewhat surprising if you didn't watch the Wisconsin part of this video. We will talk about that in a moment. But first thing I want to do, I also did this in my previous Ohio State roster breakdown that I did on this channel, which you can go ahead and go and look at that if you want to. But I am a Michigan fan. Now, that being said, I am also an adult. So I don't take the rivalry outside of rivalry week. I think you're a loser if you do. Like, I'm gonna give you two examples of both sides of this rivalry that annoys me beyond belief. Like, if you're one of those people on Twitter that uses the red X instead of the letter M, like, constantly, like, throughout the whole year. Like, I was on Twitter literally today, and I saw some Ohio State fan in, like, the part of Twitter where you swipe to the left and it's, like, not just people who you follow. Recommended for you section of Twitter. There was an Ohio State fan, and he had the fucking red X. Like, it was his name, and it, like, started with an M, and there was a red X there. Like, that guy's a loser. Like, that's stupid. Okay? Now, as far as the Michigan side of this thing, the only account on Twitter that I have blocked is the Michigan Countdown Clock, because that is some soft-ass poverty program bullshit, and I don't want to be part of it. For those of you unaware, the Michigan Countdown Clock, all it does is, like, once a day, it just tweets out how many days it's been since Ohio State has beaten Michigan. And it started in fucking 2020 when that game got canceled. Like, it didn't even start after we beat you in 2021. Like, at least then it would make sense. But it didn't start then. It started in goddamn 2020, which we would have gotten fucking obliterated. That game would have been like 78-7. But just really petty stuff like that, especially outside of, like, the Sunday before the game until, like, the Monday afterwards, because you got to go into work and take your L. That's, like, what I refer to as rivalry week. That's just, there's no point in doing it. It's not fun for me. I think it's extraordinarily childish. So when I'm talking about you and your team, I'm not doing it as a Michigan fan. I'm doing it as a football fan, okay? Nothing that I say to you is going to be biased by the fact that I'm wearing a Michigan baseball cap right now. Actually, I'm wearing a Red Wings hat right now, but that's not the point. I just wanted to get that out there, clear the air a little bit, because I am very interested in what you think about what I'm going to say about these games, because I think you might have the most 50-50 games of any team in the Big Ten right now. Let's start with the first 3 weeks. Indiana, Youngstown State, Western Kentucky. None of these people deserve to be on the same field with you. They're going to lose by 50 points. Then you go to Notre Dame. And if I was coming at this from a biased Michigan perspective, I would tell you Notre Dame has a very good offensive line. Your defensive line has not been as stout against the run as it could be, and you lost your best run defender in Zach Harrison. And Notre Dame finally has an elite quarterback in Sam Hartman, and they've got some wide receivers, and their defense is going to play well, I think. And you're going to lose this game in Notre Dame because Marcus Freeman needs a signature slash program building win, and this might be his best shot at that. All of which I believe is true. There's just one mitigating factor. I don't think Marcus Freeman is a very good football coach, and Ryan Day undoubtedly is. I think he's going to be able to scheme up a game plan that will get you into the end zone quite a bit. I think your defense is going to come to play because the narrative surrounding these past 2 years has been the defense can't play well against anybody with a pulse. It's kind of like what Michigan's defense was under Don Brown. When they're better athletically than everybody else, they dominate. But when they play somebody that can play at their level, they're not that good. And unfortunately for you, I do think Mike Knowles is closer to Don Brown than he is Mike McDonald or Jesse Minter. Now, I do think you're going to beat Notre Dame because I do think they're a little bit overrated this year, even though I love Sam Hartman. But I'm skeptical of their offensive line outside of Joe Alt. Their receiving core is probably good, but like we don't really know. And the defense, I think, would get better, but they also don't really have any like genuine superstars on that defense. So I think you're going to be able to move the ball. And assuming Kyle McCord isn't just an absolute flop, which is very unlikely, well, it's unlikely that he's going to be a flop, not likely that he's going to be a flop, then you'll be able to score points. I don't think it'll be a blowout necessarily, but I think it might be something like 17-28 or 24-35, something like that, where you win pretty handedly, but Notre Dame didn't get embarrassed. But I would still quantify it as a 50-50 game. It would not shock me if Sam Hartman plays really well and they win that game on the back of their running back's offensive line and Sam Hartman playing well. The following week against Maryland, again, a little bit sneaky. Talila Tagovailoa is very good. I think Mike Locksley is an excellent play caller, but I think you win that game like 90% of the time. Purdue, another sneaky team. I think Ryan Walters is a very good coach, and Hudson Card is a quality quarterback. But again, I just think you're too talented for that team. I mean, you never know with the spoiler makers. They might pull off the goddamn upset. But I'm not going to predict that. I'm not going to go out on my ass to predict that. I'm not that confident that it can happen. The following week versus Penn State, I talked about this more in the section previous to this, which was Penn State. I'm going to give you kind of the Spark Notes version of this. But Penn State, even though they always play their best game of the year against you guys, never fucking win. So you're going to get a W there. Then the following week, in what could be a very close game against Penn State, perhaps an emotional win, you're going to go to Camp Randall against a coach that is going to be extraordinarily motivated to coach against you, and a team that is going to be way better than people think they're going to be, that also has that quote-unquote matchup thing that I talked about with Notre Dame, but I think they're going to be better at it than Notre Dame, and a much better football coach than Notre Dame in Luke Fickell. But nevertheless, I think that is the toughest game on your schedule. I really believe that. I think you have a better chance of beating Michigan than you do Wisconsin. This just feels like one of those things where it's like everybody says, oh yeah, that's a game that you got to look out for, and then nobody predicts you to lose the game, and then you lose the game. That's kind of what I feel like it is. I think it's a sort of Urban Meyer, not really an Urban Meyer loss. Like Urban Meyer always had that one game where he didn't fucking show up. Like he'd lose to Purdue or Iowa randomly, like 55-24 for no goddamn reason. Like Urban Meyer always had one of those games, but Ryan Day really hasn't. I just genuinely think Wisconsin's going to pull off that game. I think Tanner Mordecai, their QB, is good enough to keep you honest. I think Braylon Allen is utterly phenomenal as a running back. I think their offensive line is good enough to, if they play above their weight class a little bit, getting up to play you guys, they could potentially start moving the ball on the ground And I think the defense is going to be inspired to play really, really well and potentially might get some stops. I am putting my balls on the table here a little bit with this. I'm being honest with you. And I know that. It would have been way safer to just have you go 12-0 or say you're going to lose to Michigan. But I don't have that in me. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But I'm not doing that because I think the game that you are most likely to lose, outside of my hesitations about predicting you losing to Michigan, I think the game that you're most likely to lose is Wisconsin. I don't think you're more likely to lose to Michigan than you are Wisconsin. Everything is going to align with this Wisconsin team to me. And I think Luke Fickell is going to come out and coach his ass off and do everything that it takes to beat you. And I think he's going to get it done. I got to be honest with you. Now, the next 3 weeks, again, they're okay. Greg Schiano is a good coach. MSU is going to be okay. Minnesota's going to be okay, but you're going to win those games. And then you go to Ann Arbor versus Michigan. And I'm going to lay the case out for you why Michigan might win this game. They've won the last 2. It seems that the script has flipped between you and Michigan. It seems like you have the questionable defensive coordinator, even though you have all of the talent and all of the NFL draft picks. You have a questionable defensive coordinator that shits the bed when you play your main rivalry game. And Michigan just always plays their best against you guys. I think that is probably the best argument for Michigan winning that game. But as I told you earlier on in this segment, I am a Michigan fan. And more importantly than that, I'm a 25-year-old Michigan fan who didn't really get into football until 2006. So throughout all of my formative years, I never saw Michigan beat Ohio State outside of 2011. But if I'm being entirely honest with you, I don't really think that game counts. That wasn't a real quote-unquote Ohio State team. So the first time I saw a real Michigan team beat a real Ohio State team was 2021. So if I'm being entirely honest with you, I think for the first time in like 2 decades, I think you're going to see a majority of pundits and people that are allegedly neutral predict Michigan to win that game. I think there's a solid chance they're going to be favored when the time comes. And there's also a good chance that you're 11-0 and they are also 11-0. But as someone who grew up constantly losing to Ohio State, I do not have it in me to predict, to put pen to paper, that you're going to lose to Michigan, even though I think it's probably a 50-50 game. And this year, to me, really is going to solidify if the roles actually have flipped. Like 2021, that game was potentially like what Penn State 2016 was, where it was like a once-in-a-generation sort of win. But then we won last year as well. So that was interesting. It was like, oh man, they went back-to-back. That's weird. If they win 3 in a row, then the script really has been flipped. And maybe I could predict that they're going to beat you next year. But then there is also going to be other factors, like Michigan is going to need a new quarterback next year in all likelihood. So maybe not even next year I'm going to be able to predict Michigan to beat Ohio State. I just don't have it in me. So if you were looking for me to lay out a reason why I think you're going to beat Michigan, my reason why is that I am a Michigan fan that grew up in an era where Michigan didn't beat Ohio State. And I don't have anything other than a feeling like that I just can't predict Ohio State to lose to Michigan, even though the rational side of my brain tells me there's a very good chance that happens. Let's get away from that for a minute here, and I'm going to give you some general thoughts that I've got on your team. I think you are head and shoulders above everybody else in the country in terms of draftable talent. I think you could have 16, 17, maybe potentially 18 players drafted in the 2024 draft class. I think at a minimum, you're going to have 14 players drafted next year in all likelihood. I think you could have 3 or 4 first-round picks. I think Tui Maloau is likely going to be a top 10 pick. I think Jack Sawyer has the potential. I think Tommy Eichenberg has the potential. I don't think Denzel Burke has the potential. I have no idea how he's getting mocked in the first round. He's like a fourth round pick for me right now. But he's not your CB1 anymore, so that he'll get better because of that. And Kyle McCord, if he plays really well, could be a first round pick. So this is a very, very, very talented team. Donovan Jackson also a sneaky first round talent. But I want to, right now, having said everything that I've said, I want to walk you through what to me is probably just as likely to happen as going 12-0, and that's 8-4. And I'm going to lay it out for you. Your offensive line is almost certainly going to get worse. Last year, you had the best offensive line in football, and I say that as a fan of the two-time defending team that won the award for the best offensive line in college football. I could not believe that it was Georgia instead of you as like the finalists. You had a better offensive line than Michigan did last year, and you had the best offensive line in the country last year. But it's going to get worse this year. I don't think a Paris Johnson is going to show up and play left tackle for you. By the way, I fucking love Paris Johnson. I loved him as a prospect. I had a top 10 grade on him this past year, and he was my tackle one. I loved Paris Johnson as a prospect. And I really liked your right tackle, too, whose name is escaping me. I had a top 50 grade on him as well. He also had a good center, but you're replacing the three most important positions on the offensive line: center, left tackle, and right tackle. And with Kyle McCord, the best case scenario for him is he is a less mobile version of CJ Stroud. He's like the first quarterback of my lifetime that you've had that can't move around very much. He's not a statue, but he's not as athletic or mobile as CJ Stroud. And CJ Stroud didn't show that a whole lot, but he could run and move around when he needed to. And I'm not sure Kyle McCord can. And you factor that with an offensive line that is maybe getting worse. And now, by the way, when I say worse, I mean like instead of being the best offensive line in college football, you're going to be like a top 20 offensive line in college football. I'm not saying it's going to be bad or liability or anything, but when you factor in all of those factors, the regressing offensive line, the unproven quarterback who's not mobile, a defensive coordinator that seemingly shits the bed in big games, then depending upon how poor Kyle McCord plays, like if the offensive line is just a good and not elite, then a team like Notre Dame or Michigan or Penn State could get consistent pressure. And if that happens, Kyle McCord not being as mobile is going to be more affected by it than CJ Stroud was or previous Ohio State quarterbacks were, which is going to limit your ceiling as an offense. Now, I think your running game is going to be good enough to where the passing game doesn't particularly matter. I think Mayan Williams is a top 5 running back in the country. I think Travion Henderson is good. Not top 10, but solid. He's fast. So 8-4, I think you're probably looking at like a 10% chance to go 8-4. But I think you're also looking at like a 10% chance that you're going to go 12-0. I don't think it's very likely. I think the Big Ten is dramatically improved on like a team-by-team basis. I think there are only really 3 teams that are flat out bad in the Big Ten this year. So the chances of catching a stray might be higher this year than it has been in years past. And you have 4 games this year that I think are genuine 50-50 games and 2 games that could be sneaky upsets. That's half your schedule. I don't think you're getting through that unscathed. And what I've laid out before you is probably best case scenario in terms of like realistically setting expectations for the season. 11-1 with a loss to Wisconsin in Camp Randall. Now, with you beating Michigan the last game of the season, you're going to rematch with Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game, and I'll talk about that later on in the video. You can look in the description if you just want to skip to that, because I am going to move on now. Michigan. I saved the best for last, right? Well, maybe. It's a pretty easy schedule to talk about. I don't really think we have a whole lot of 50-50 games. I think there are only three games that are kind of concerning, but they're all pretty well timed, so I'm not really concerned about them being upsets or potentially look ahead games. I don't think any of them are set up like that, and those three games are at Nebraska, at Minnesota, and at Maryland. All three of those games are relatively concerning. I think Nebraska is probably the best because Matt Rule is going to be looking for a signature program building win, and he could get it. It's possible. I mean, I wouldn't give Nebraska or Minnesota higher than like a 15 or 20% chance of beating us. I think Maryland, it's probably more like 25%. I do think Maryland is significantly better than Nebraska and Minnesota. All three games are on the road and against teams that are going to be looking for the upset. They're really going to be pining for it. As far as 50-50 games go, there are only two this year, and that's Penn State and Ohio State. And in true 50-50 fashion, I have you winning one and losing the other. A preferable scenario would be to lose to Penn State in Penn State and then beat Ohio State at the end of the year, because then you're 11-1 and you beat Ohio State. So who can really take that away from you? But I've just got to go with my rational mind here. I think, much like last year, I think Penn State and Michigan are pretty similar levels of team. Michigan may be just slightly better, but Michigan is just flat out and straight up a bad matchup for Penn State. They were last year and they are this year. Really, since Jim Harbaugh kind of changed the culture in 2021, that's just been the case. I knew by like week 1 or 2 in 2021 that Michigan was going to beat Penn State, and same thing last year as well, because the offensive line was so good, and Penn State's weakness has been these past 2 years has been at the inside linebacker position and the interior of the defensive line, and that's arguably Michigan's biggest strength is their guard and center play and their ability to get to the second level. Penn State also lost the best corner in the Big Ten last year in Joey Porter Jr. and a very good safety in Jair Brown that they're going to be looking to replace. Now, this is late enough in the season where neither one of those losses are going to be particularly felt. If this was earlier on in the year, then probably that would be more of a bigger point. But they should have things figured out by the 10th game of the season. So unless they straight up are just drop-offs at those positions, which I think is fairly unlikely, Penn State does reload the secondary very well, or at least they have in the past 4 or 5 years, then it's not going to be really something that you can probably exploit. But I think that game, more than probably any other game, you're going to see Michigan just straight up lean into the run game and just be like, yeah, we're going to grind this game out, and we're going to do what we did all of 2021 and all of 2022. Now, outside of that game, I think you're going to see more passes this year than in previous years. I think the percentage is still going to be run leaning. I think it's likely to be somewhere around 55 to 58% run and 45 to 42% pass, especially earlier on in the year. I think the first 4 weeks, they're going to kind of let J.J. McCarthy sling it a little bit, get him some confidence heading into the tougher part of your schedule, which Nebraska, Minnesota on the road, back-to-back weeks. That's somewhat tough. It could be kind of challenging. And early on in the year, I think they're going to want to get JJ's confidence levels up so that he can sling it when they actually need him to sling it. Worst case scenario, if he has a bad game against Nebraska, like he's thrown 2 interceptions in the first half, but it's like 14-10 Nebraska or something like that, then we can just lean into the run game and probably grind out a relatively close win. Also, with every team, every year, you have one game that you show up for, and last year that game for Michigan was Penn State, and you have one game a year where you don't show up, and last year it was Illinois. I think there is a decent probability that Michigan beats Penn State and loses to Ohio State. Maryland the following week after Penn State is somewhat concerning. It's potentially a trap game, but I don't think it's actually going to be a trap game because I think Michigan, the past few years, Maryland has played them close. I think they know that they have to pay attention to that game. So I think with Purdue also kind of being a tough team as well, but again, I just think Michigan is a worse matchup for Purdue than they are for Penn State. Like for Penn State, they're just a bad matchup. For Purdue, it's like everything they do well is our weaknesses. So really, these last 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks with MSU, I think this team is going to turn it on, and I don't really think they're going to have a problem with a trap game this year or something like that. So I think they're going to beat Maryland. I think that game fairly likely to be high scoring. I don't see. I could see a possible game where it's like 42 Michigan, 31 Maryland, or like 24 or 34 or 38, 28, something like that. But I do think Michigan wins fairly handedly. But Maryland is a good quality football team this year. Talila Tagovailoa is a very good quarterback, and you do have to pay attention to that game if you're the Michigan Wolverines. Now, before we talk about the last game of the season, I'm just going to kind of circle back and talk about a few of the earlier games. I didn't mean to go all out of order like this, but it's just what came to mind. Michigan State, I think, is going to be better than they were last year. I think they're going to play just well enough for Mel Tucker to keep his job, but I do not believe that they are going to be able to compete with Michigan. It is a rivalry game, so you never know. Really, they could show up to play, and Michigan could have their letdown game against Michigan State, and it could just be a whirlwind of perfect everything for Michigan State like the 2021 game was, and you could see an upset there. That's not out of the realm of possibilities, but I do think it's unlikely, and I think Nebraska, Minnesota, and Maryland have a better chance of pulling off the upset than Michigan State does. The rest of the teams, Rutgers, Indiana, Bowling Green, UNLV, East Carolina, none of those teams are going to beat you. Even if this team ends up being the worst that this team could possibly be, you're still going to win those 5 games. Now, Ohio State, the last game of the schedule, I am predicting an L. I am a Michigan fan. This channel has been majority Michigan content so far. There will still be a lot of Michigan content going forward during the season. I'll talk about Michigan a lot as well. But this isn't just a Michigan channel. It's a college football and NFL football channel. But I'm predicting the loss to Ohio State for a few reasons. One, there are actual reasons to believe Ohio State is a better team than Michigan this year. Ohio State is the most talented team in the country, and it is not close. They have more talent than Georgia this year. They're probably going to have more draft picks in 2024 NFL draft than Georgia did in 2021 or 2022. I think Ohio State, at a minimum, probably has 14 players drafted, and realistically, you could see 16 or 17. And Georgia set the record with 16 for most players drafted, with 16, I believe. I think Ohio State this year could break that record. That is a very, very, very talented team. They have 2 high-quality running backs. Mayan Williams is a top 5 running back in college football. Travion Henderson is a good backup running back. The offensive line is going to be good. They have the best receiving core in the country. 2 first-round lock wide receivers, both of which probable to go in the top 20. Marvin Harrison isn't making it out of the top 5. He's a generational wide receiver prospect. He's very, 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 very good. And the defense, year 2 in Mike Knowles' scheme. Now, I think Mike Knowles is Ohio State's Don Brown, but year 2 in the scheme, they could be better. They have multiple potential first-round picks on defense. I think their secondary got better with the addition of the transfer from Ole Miss and at the cornerback position, and I think that will make their secondary a lot better because now Denzel Burke is in your corner 1, and you can put them both kind of on islands against Michigan receivers. Michigan's receivers aren't great. I think they're good, but they're definitely not great, and be better off than last year, assuming all of their defensive line pieces can stay healthy. They will almost certainly be able to get pressure on J.J. McCarthy. Now, he'll have to run around and make some plays, which he's perfectly capable of doing. But Michael Hall is a phenomenal pass rusher. He might be the best interior pass rusher in all of college football. JT Tuimoloau is a probable top 10 pick. Jack Sawyer has a lot of talent to go in the first round potentially. Tommy Eichenberg is the best linebacker in college football. This team is extraordinarily talented. And I do think Michigan can beat them. In fact, the rational side of my mind says there's a damn good chance Michigan does. I think Michigan has the best offensive line in the Big Ten. Ohio State has more top end talent on their defensive line than Michigan, but I think Michigan has way more depth. I think, unlike last year, Michigan is going to be able to rush the passer against Ohio State and basically anybody in the country with improvements on the defensive line and transfers added in, like the Coastal Carolina kid, and guys like Derek Moore and Braden McGregor getting better, potentially Jalen Harrell as well, plus having more interior juice with guys like Chris Jenkins, Rayshawn Benny, and Mason Graham. I think the pass rush is going to be much improved. I think we got better at linebacker. Junior Colson got better from freshman to sophomore year. I think he's going to get better from sophomore to junior year, especially with a new linebacker coach. I think Ernest Hausman is better than both linebackers that played a lot last year. And Mike Bennett is a quality rotational piece who will be in sub packages and will have a role. I think the secondary is going to be just as good as it was last year. Will Johnson probably gets better. I think cornerback 2 could potentially be even less of a weakness than it was last year. And Mike Sanders still in the slot is really good. Our safeties are really good, both of them, and the depth. The defense, I think, could be better than last year. I think the offense is going to be better than last year. I think this overall team is going to be better than last year. The rational side of my mind says Jim Harbaugh has changed the culture of the University of Michigan, and now they have made Ohio State a focus, and he probably has some analysts doing scouting work on Ohio State every game, and he's really taking that game seriously, and he's won the last 2, and J.J. McCarthy is a leader and a very good quarterback, and the offense could potentially be much better and much more explosive in the passing game this year. All of these things are things that the rational side of my brain wants to say Michigan is going to beat Ohio State. All of those things make me think Michigan is going to win that game. But I'm also 25. I was born in 1997. And when I was growing up, Michigan didn't beat Ohio State. So I just don't have it in me to predict that Ohio State is going to beat Michigan. I think right now it is a true 50-50 game. And I'm going to have to admit bias with predicting Michigan to lose to Ohio State. But I just can't do it. I just can't predict Ohio State to lose to Michigan, even though the last 2 years, Michigan has very clearly been the better team both times, at least on that day. So flame me in the comments if you want to. I'm not going to fight you. If you want to say Michigan is going 12-0, I think that's fairly likely. I want Michigan to beat Ohio State because I am a Michigan fan, and I will be rooting for them to win that game. I don't really give a shit if my prediction is wrong, but I just can't predict it. I just can't put pen to paper and actually predict that Michigan is going to win that game. Maybe if they win this year and I feel confident enough, I can predict Michigan to win next year, maybe. But that's it for all of the team-by-team breakdowns. Let's go ahead and move into the award sections of this video. Awards. Real quick, I'm going to tell you what the awards are, what the acronyms all stand for, if you don't know. POTY is Player of the Year. OPOY is Offensive Player of the Year. DPOY is Defensive Player of the Year. BPOY is Breakout Player of the Year. MIPOY is Most Improved Player of the Year. And ROTI is Rookie of the Year. The difference between Breakout Player of the Year and Most Improved Player of the Year is pretty simple. Breakout player is somebody who was a non-factor last year and is now a very good player. Most improved player is somebody who played and maybe was bad or below average, and this year they're good to great to potentially even a superstar. So you see the awards and who wins them. Let's start at the top. Player of the Year for the Big Ten Conference is going to be Braylon Allen from Wisconsin. That is what I'm predicting. I am predicting Wisconsin to go 10-2 and upset Ohio State. If you didn't look at those sections of the video, you can go back and see my reasonings for why that happened. And I think Braylon Allen is going to have like a vintage Wisconsin running back type of season this year. So I'm predicting him to be a Player of the Year candidate. Offensive Player of the Year, I've going Marvin Harrison Jr., Ohio State. He's probably going to break some Ohio State receiving records this year and be a top 5 pick in the draft. Defensive Player of the Year, there's a few strong contenders for this award, but I'm going with Chop Robinson out of Penn State. I do ultimately think he is going to have the best stats of anybody in order to win this award. Breakout Player of the Year, Caden Prather from Maryland. He is a wide receiver. I also believe he is a transfer. Last year he was okay. This year, I think he's going to be their wide receiver 1 and potentially a all Big Ten first team candidate, even with both Ohio State wide receivers doing what they're going to do. I think Caden Prather will be right there. Maybe not in terms of draft, but in terms of production. Most improved player of the year, I'm going with Cade McNamara. I could speak as a Michigan fan. Cade McNamara was not a good football player for Michigan. I think he has the opportunity to be a solid football player who can get you 220, 250 yards and 2 touchdowns without turning the ball over every game. And then you can lean on the run game for Iowa. He was not that for Michigan in 2021. Basically, anytime he threw the ball more than 20 times, he was making some poor decisions throughout the game. But I think he can be the best version of what Iowa wants at the quarterback position this year. Rookie of the Year, I'm going with Malachi Coleman from Nebraska, a wide receiver. I think he's going to be electric. I think he's going to be a very, very, very good player. I don't think Nebraska has a whole lot of receiving options right now, and he is, I think, going to be the best one. He's listed at 6'4", 190, so I think he's an ex-receiver. I think he's going to be able to win jump balls. I think he's going to be good enough route running to get open consistently. I think Malachi Coleman is going to be a superstar in the Big Ten for the next few years. So that was the awards. We will circle back to this at the end of the regular season and see if my predictions all came back. And that's not just for the awards, but for the whole video too. I mean, I'm not scared of being wrong or having bad predictions or bad preseason takes, because everybody's wrong all the goddamn time. I'm just going to be honest about it. I'm going to be upfront with you. Like, I'm not going to hide the videos or delete them if I make a really bad prediction. I'm just giving you my opinion. And if you disagree with it, that's fine. So let's go ahead and get into the first team all Big Ten predictions that I'm going to make. At the quarterback position, I am predicting Tulila Tagovailoa from Maryland to get the first team nod. I just don't know enough about Kyle McCord in order to predict that he becomes the first team all Big Ten quarterback, even though he's probably the most likely candidate to have the best stats in the Big Ten. J.J. McCarthy, also a contender, but I think he's more of an outside shot kind of guy. I think it's more likely to be Tulila Tagovailoa or Kyle McCord than it is J.J. McCarthy. At running back, I'm predicting Blake Corum because I think the media will just give it to him based off of name and the fact that he's really good. But I don't think he will probably be the best or second best running back in the Big Ten number-wise. I think Nick Singleton and Mayan Williams will both eclipse him in terms of statistics and could end up being Braylon Allen's mate here at the all Big Ten first team. Braylon Allen, I think, is going to eclipse 2,000 yards. I think he's a dark horse Heisman candidate and is going to be very, very, very good. The wide receivers are going to be the Ohio State wide receivers. They're always Ohio State wide receivers, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Tight end, though, I am going out on a little bit of a limb here by predicting Colston Loveland and not Brevin Spann-Ford, which would be the much safer pick here. But I think Colston Loveland is very likely to be the number one target on the Michigan offense, and I do think they're going to throw the ball more. So I think he's a strong candidate for the position of all Big Ten first team tight end. For the offensive line, I've got Olu Fashanu, Donovan Jackson, Drake Nugent, Zach Zinter, and Josh Simmons as the 5 guys that are likely to be the Big Ten all first team. I think you could go ahead and lock Olu Fashanu, Donovan Jackson, and Drake Nugent into those positions. I think you could potentially see somebody other than Zach Zinter or Josh Simmons as the other guard and the other tackle. But I think those 3 guys, Fashanu, Jackson, and Nugent, are pretty much guarantees to end up as the all Big Ten first team players. The flex, I have Isaiah Williams from Illinois. Beginning out the defense, as the edge, I have JT Tuimoloau. On the interior, I have Jerzon Newton and Keith Randolph Jr., both from Illinois. And the other edge rusher, my defensive player of the year, Chop Robinson out of Penn State. The 2 linebackers I've got are Tommy Eichenberg from Ohio State and Abdul Carter from Penn State. I think there are several contenders for all of these positions. The Big Ten is pretty loaded along the defensive line, and they've got some potentially very good linebackers as well. But these are the guys that I think are really going to stand out on the defensive side of the ball. I think you could see Keith Randolph Jr. potentially slip to the second team for a guy like Michael Hall from Ohio State or Mason Graham from Michigan, but I think Keith Randolph is better than both of them right now. Linebacker position, for me, it's Tommy Eichenberg and everybody else, but I think Abdul Carter is going to have a very, very good year for Penn State. I think he's going to be very productive, maybe even a few interceptions, so I think he's likely to be a strong contender for the Big Ten first team. As the secondary, I've got Will Johnson at the cornerback position and Rod Moore at the free safety position, both from Michigan. At the strong safety position, I have John Torchio from Wisconsin. At the other cornerback position, I have Kalen King from Penn State. In the slot, I have Mike Sanderstill from Michigan. And the flex, I have Cooper DeJean from Iowa. Every single one of these players are really, really good and quality NFL prospects. I think all of them, except for Mike Sanderstill, are at least day 2 picks. I think Will Johnson, Rod Moore, Kalen King, and Cooper DeJean all have the chance to go in the first round. Rod Moore less so, but those 3 corners are really, really good. Unlike a lot of other positions on this team, I think this is pretty set. I think these are the best players at their position in the entire Big Ten. I don't really think there's a whole lot of conversation. Maybe at the cornerback position, there are a couple options that you could look at, but I think these 3 guys, Johnson, King, and DeJean, are way above the rest of the players, in my opinion. Finally, we're going to finish off this video by discussing the Big Ten championship game between Wisconsin and Ohio State. In the last year of divisions in the Big Ten, I think Ohio State is going to win the East, and I think Wisconsin is going to win the West. And I think Ohio State is going to enact revenge and end up at 12-1 with the somewhat automatic playoff berth of winning the Big Ten and go to the college football playoffs. I think Wisconsin winning earlier on in the year is a prelude to this event, and I don't think they can beat Ohio State twice. The question now is, can Michigan or any other Big Ten team make the playoffs as an 11-1 team? And I, generally speaking, think there's a possibility. But I think the way the SEC is set up this year, where they have 3 likely top 5 teams in LSU, Georgia, and Alabama, one of them is probably going to be 11-1, and the other 2 are probably going to be 12-0 and meet in the championship game, in which case you'll have a 12-1 SEC championship loser, a 13-0 SEC champion, and a 11-1 SEC team that is either going to be Alabama, LSU, or Georgia. And if that is Alabama, then they're going to get in over an 11-1 Michigan team almost certainly, or any team really, Ohio State included. Penn State probably as well. Alabama would get over Penn State too. And I generally think that much like how 2013 was the best case for making a 4-team playoff, I think this season is going to be the best case for the 12-team playoff format. I think you're going to win. I think you're going to see multiple one-loss or undefeated conference champions from the Pac-12 and the Big 12 and the ACC. I think two of those three teams are likely to just be undefeated or 12-1, in which case they're both getting in. I think you're going to see a couple of SEC teams with the one loss. I think you're going to see potentially two Big Ten teams with just one loss vying for a playoff position, as well as potentially just other teams that could get in there as well. So I think this year is going to be the best case scenario for what the 12-team playoff could be in the future. Whew, man. And that caps off this hour and a half long, maybe a little bit longer video. If you stuck around for the whole thing, thank you a lot. Yeah, it means a whole lot to me that you would watch all of this. Or even if you just went to your team and then skipped to the end to the awards and then now you're listening to this. Thank you for watching. And I'm going to remind you once again to like the video if you liked the video. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And if you disagreed or if you just have something to say, go ahead and leave me a comment down in the comment section below. But let's keep it civil. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole. And I'll see you next time.